You can help support the channel by heading to our merchandise store and picking up some of our great aircraft designs created by our graphic designer. We have everything from fighters to transport aircraft, which you can choose to have printed on t-shirts, mugs, stickers and much more. Head to the description below and click the links and pick up your design today. Thank you and enjoy.
I guess maybe switch to the F-16 now.
Yeah, let's go for a couple of stories on the F-16, Carl.
So as people, if people have not seen your previous videos with me, after 1986, so right after El Dorado Canyon, I had already, decided to volunteer to be an air liaison officer, and the promise was, well, after you do this terrible deal working as an Air Force officer with the Army, which turned out not to be that terrible. I actually liked it. So to me, I was just fine. And it was very interesting because I got to learn a lot about the Army but your viewers want to learn about the Air Force. So we'll pass that. But the bottom line is after that tour, I got switched to the F-16 and I ended up flying the F-16 at Hahn Air Base in Germany for about 2.5 years. At the time, the F-16 did not have AMRAAMs yet, so we were guns on AIM-9s only. But no, we did have the pretty good AIM-9 for the time, AIM-9 Mike, which was indeed capable of frontal aspect engagement, assuming that the target was fast enough and did not use counter-IR tactics, which means reducing power and flares. So, if they were using those, they could avoid a frontal engagement as well. When we were fighting, mostly the Bitburg F-15s was one of our main adversaries that we used to engage in DACT with. It was kind of a disadvantage because, of course, they did not have AMRAAM at the time either, but they did have AIM-7s. So they had the AIM-7F and then the M model, which was pretty capable, although it did require them to keep a lock on the target for engagement. So at the time, we did do the ACT on a fairly regular basis with them, although our main mission at Hahn was air-to-ground, including the nuclear mission. But we did do a fair amount of DACT. And one of our main bases that we would, engage with is the Bitburg F-15. So, because they were always looking for dissimilar adversaries, and Hahn was not very far from Bitburg, so it allowed us to go to a training area which wasn't too far, and we would have a lot of fuel to process, multiple engagements during one sortie. Even though for air-to-air, we would only carry typically the centerline tank, not the wing tanks. But again, because we didn't have far to go to the area, that left us plenty of fuel. So what was interesting about engaging the F-15 back then was we would have to, do all kinds of tactics to avoid their AIM-7s, and then, try to see if we could get in a close-in engagement fight with them, at which point then the odds were a lot more even. I would say they weren't quite even in the sense that air-to-air was all they did. So obviously, compared to our maybe 40% at the most of sorties dedicated to air-to-air, and even when I say 40%, that's pretty optimistic. I think on average it was closer to 30%, so maybe 1/3. And a lot of those were BFM, basic fighter maneuvers, so maybe one-on-one, and only a few were dissimilar air combat tactics sorties, so like 4v4. So they did have a pretty significant advantage in that sense, but in my opinion, it was more than offset by the fact that we were way smaller. So our visual signature was a lot smaller, and one of the biggest advantages we had was that once we got into a turning fight with the F-15s, they would lose sight a lot, whereas it was much easier for us to keep track of where they were. It's particularly important when you do anything above a 2v2, because 2v2, you can sort of keep track of where people are at, although even that takes a bit of effort, particularly in the days before, Link 16, JTIDs, all that stuff that are in the modern versions of all these aircraft. This was before that time. So, maintaining situation awareness was paramount, and that was quite difficult at times. But once we got into a turning fight, I think the overall advantage turned to the F-16 simply because not so much of the aircraft's maneuverability being superior or anything. They were pretty evenly matched, in my opinion. Now, the higher you went, the more the F-15 had the advantage, and the lower you went, the more the F-16 had the advantage, in general. But the pilot would make most of the difference. But again, the size of the aircraft made a huge difference. They would lose sight of us all the time. And then when, lose sight, lose fight. So it was pretty simple. And that allowed us to have a pretty respectable exchange ratio against them in general. I mean, I'm not going to brag and say that we would beat the F-15s all the time. That would not be true. For sure, they were very good because that's all they did. And so they, you would expect them to be. But again, when you lose situation awareness because you can't see the other aircraft in a turning fight, that's pretty deadly. One time when I was fighting F-15s from Bitburg, suddenly one of them started spewing smoke big time from the back end. I'm like, what? And that's why I say, knock it off, basically terminate the engagement. Because I thought he had a serious problem. And then everybody was ribbing on me for calling knock it off. Say, that's no big deal. That happens all the time in the F-15. It's a compressor stall and it just recovers by itself and no big deal.
Wow.
Not a big thing. But I'm like, for them, it was no big deal because they were two engine. And I guess that's the way they were, considering it. They would just, the engine would recover by itself and then they just continue the fight. So I was told, well, don't do that again. I was like, well, I didn't know. I see smoke coming out. Well, there was no flame. It's just pure smoke. But in the F-16, though, if the same thing happened, which did, occasionally, I had compressor stalls. It was very rare, but it did happen a couple of times. And, even though the engine would recover and everything was fine, for us, it was like, okay, you return to base immediately. Right. So there was no like, oh, let's continue the engagement because single engine. So, different mentality in that respect.